My initial work, the work that I spent about 15 years doing, was about borders in the Middle East. You can imagine it's a busy time for me right now as these borders are again undergoing conflict. So I want to say, first of all, something that we're still seeing in the Middle East and experiencing is that most of the borders, most of these Middle Eastern states, were created arbitrarily. Many people call them lines in the sand. There were some British officials and French officials, sometimes Italians, Americans, and Russians came in, and they looked at a map and they drew lines. And those lines went across things like, oil wells or oil reserves. They went across things like springs and water. They went right across different ethnic communities, right across different political communities. And what was supposed to hold these states together? Well, it was kind of the shaky idea of citizenship. Right? And some people had power in this so-called citizenship and some people didn't, but that's what was supposed to bring them together. So in other words, the 15 years of researching these borders and traveling them when I could really showed me, arbitrary lines that were drawn across people's lives, and people were told, okay, live with these lines and make the best of it, and if you want to complain or rise up, well, we'll have plenty of ways to enforce that. So many people said, how would I have come to this sort of research? And my answer was always, well, I'm from Detroit. So I know very well about arbitrary lines that are drawn across people's lives and the way in which citizenship applies better to some and better to others. So my lens, it can be very confusing in a new region of the world as it was when I started this work. It can be very confusing to figure out where should I walk? Where am I not supposed to walk? Right, in my early days crossing between Israel and the Palestinian West Bank, I would forever be getting hauled out by police, and they're like, well, do you know where you're walking? And I said, well, actually, no, that's why I'm walking here, because I'm trying to figure out where I am and who's there and do some of the things Luis was talking about hearing people's stories. People would say, what are you doing? How are you crossing over there? And I would bring the same story. Well, I'm from Detroit. And in fact, I learned that landscape of the city as a whole place. Right, there were all kinds of arbitrary lines in people's imaginations, right, lines of discrimination and really unequal distribution of resources like energy and money and infrastructure and education. But, and here it's really a great tribute to my mother, who was an educator, is an educator in Detroit, that those were lines I didn't recognize. Right, where people saw lines, I actually was raised to see people and friends and neighborhoods where I knew people and had contacts. So that was the kind of perspective that I was able to bring to the Middle East, a very different reality in certain ways and totally familiar to me as a Detroiter in other ways. So, okay. So I did the research. I sort of proved these boundaries are arbitrary and unjust and unequal, and they don't really do the people who live there much good. So where do we go after that? And this is the research that I'm involved in right now. And I'll tell you the guiding premise with the hopes that it might be something also useful to the work that you're doing in your own organizations. And this is the idea of everyday life. Right, of shared space where people actually wake up in the morning and they need to eat and they need to get to work and they certainly need water to maintain their dignity and cleanliness and health. So in everyday life, we sort of look beyond all the arbitrary lines that are drawn across our world that intersect our neighborhoods and our cities and the places in which we live, and we start to realize that actually, despite the proliferation of these random lines, we're actually in the same space. We actually depend upon each other to get our basic services like energy and water and education and work and labor. We're actually all here together. And the more we think about it, the arbitrary lines come out of these different sets of beliefs in which we're raised and that we become overly attached to, right? I believe X and therefore I navigate the world in this way. Or I have a certain amount of money at my disposal, so there are places I just don't go. Or I'm a member of a certain group and I don't walk over there. But these things are actually the imaginary projections on our world. That's not our world, right? The world that we're in, we are all in it together. We're in a shared space, and we're waking up, and we're depending on each other each day. We, of course, unfortunately, see this come to the fore in occasions like Hurricane Sandy, where suddenly, if you don't have power and your house is underwater and if fires are going off, it's not the moment where you start debating your political affiliations, right? Or, you know, how entitled you feel to these resources. It's like you have to pull together because there's a disaster. And even when there's not a disaster, though, we can look above and beyond those arbitrary lines and see here we are together. Whether it's a workplace, a neighborhood, a city, we are interdependent, and we need everyone up that line, right, in order to live our lives and to be successful. This idea of everyday life, which is how I started navigating, for example, the fraught landscape of Israel and Palestine and Jordan, I started realizing, you know, there are many borders and many checkpoints and very intense barriers to interaction. But actually, it's the same small place. Everyone is in there together, and in fact, everyone depends upon one another's labor and investment and intellectual activities to make that place run. So the idea is, here we are in the same space. This, again, another shout out to my university, is something I see very well every day when I go to teach, because we have students at UIC from just about every economic background you can imagine. We've got students who are in various phases of legality, meaning we have students who are undocumented here, we have students on the brink of citizenship, we have new immigrants to this country, right? We have people who've been in Chicago many generations. We've got the range of economic backgrounds. We've got the range of status of legality. We also have the range of ethnic backgrounds. I always say, you know, someone should drop you down on our campus and say, what country are you in? Because you would be hard-pressed to say that. And so it's something, this everyday life, it works. And you'll have students, for example, I've had Lebanese students, Iraqi students, Sunni Shiite, right? Indian, Pakistani, Israeli, Palestinians. I mean, they come from parts of the world where they live amidst conflict. But we're able to sit and share that space because everyone's pursuing a common good, which is greater education, that collective goal. And we really see, and Louise, I know you once had a great op-ed piece in the New York Times about how the campus sits astride our border in Chicago between the north side and the south side, right? We really are on a border zone, as it were, of one of these imaginary lines that, of course, is very real for many people in the city. Just because they're imaginary, I want you to know, I don't think people don't experience it, right? The borders are first imaginary, and then they're realized in terms of who has access to what resources and what opportunities. We make them real. They are not, in fact, real, but our distribution of things makes these borders very real and have huge impacts on communities. So there we are. We're sitting on that border, and we're able to create a kind of everyday life in pursuit of a common goal and a common good for everyone involved. Beyond, the next step in this idea of everyday life is really taking the fact that our world is global. It is mixed economically, legally, ethnically, racially, in terms of gender. This is our world. But many people do a lot of things to not realize this is the world we're in. So, okay, we have many of us, we're nodding, right? We realize that we're living in a world with people, different experiences, different backgrounds, different challenges that face them day in and day out. So, you know, beyond this idea of how to negotiate conflict in terms of alerting people to the fact that they are in the same place in the same time and that the barriers that separate them are arbitrary. So what's another way in which we can realize that? Well, again, in the work you do, it's very much about working with I mean, again, I don't do your work, so I don't really know, but but imagining this, right? It's about integrating management, workers, right? Customers, people with different backgrounds, different issues, different challenges. So on the one hand, it's about creating that space of realization about interdependency and the importance of that. Well, how have I been working on this in terms of the conflict-ridden Middle East? This is where the idea that our space is not only defined by our daily needs and our daily experiences, and not only defined by our stories, which is central to this, but it's also defined by very real factors like water and energy. And again, we're seeing this. I mean, I wish this were not my illustrating example of the devastation on the East Coast. I mean, I wish we weren't speaking about it, but it does illustrate it very well. The idea that our resources are finite and they need to serve everybody in this space of everyday life. So the kind of work that I'm involved with right now is in Jordan, Palestine, and Israel, and it surrounds the idea of trying to build community and interaction around shared resources like water. So, for example, the organization with which I work, Friends of the Earth Middle East, and it's a remarkable organization because there's actually equal offices in Amman, Jordan, in Bethlehem, Palestine, and Tel Aviv, Israel. There's 3 directors, right, with the same title and the same amount of authority in these 3 cities. So what have we been doing? Well, the first thing we've said is waste knows no borders, right? You can draw all the state lines you want, but waste flows down. So the first thing that's been done is literally integrating communities affected by the same waste runoff and the same things that are disposed of by creating shared recycling centers, wastewater management, and very creative ways to kind of build and maintain infrastructure using recycled materials, right? You start to get everyone together, which is not around what are your feelings about politics, right? Who do you support? What's your religion? But literally, like if we don't take care of the waste together, it's going to win, right, over human life in general. The next phase is really looking at water distribution, right? How do water lines run? We are not quite seeing this yet in our own country, but in countries like the Middle East and Africa, right, water pipes go in one direction, which is usually towards wealthy communities, and they turn away from other directions, which are usually poor communities. So the first thing is to have everyone take a good look at who's served by water infrastructure and who's denied access to it. And then in that look, the idea is to reach a more equitable distribution of resources like water, which has a really good effect on everybody. Because everybody at this moment in time has to take a good look at how they use water. And again, so apologies to anyone with a second home in Vegas, but you can't have things like swimming pools and golf, what are they called? Golf courses, thank you. Golf courses in the desert. Right? So everybody, right, no matter your background, has to take a good look at how they're using the resource, and that really highlights the fact that it is a shared resource. And the idea of shared resources, right? I mean, if you're on an energy grid and you lose energy for a minute and you start seeing who around you has lost energy, you get a very real sense of everyday life. Right? We're all living and we're connected to the grid. And if there's people not connected to the grid, we have to take a good look at that. And we have to think about how to get them connected to the grid. And if it means using a little less energy, in one place, we've got to really look at that. Because this is the way. On the one hand, what I'm saying here is we are sharing this everyday life together. We're in it. But, at the same time, while we're in it, our perspectives and our experiences are very determined by arbitrary lines. And so how do we both realize we're living together and look over those arbitrary lines? The point that I'm making is a wonderful way to do that, is this clear look on how we need to and how we already work together. There's a more glamorous phase to this. I think waste management and water distribution is kind of glamorous, but it's probably because I was trained in religious studies. So I'm like, whoa, scientists, these people, the water grid. It's a bit of a new perspective for me. But the more glamorous part of this, which is also an integral part of this, is the idea of culture. Because if you're going to be realizing our shared space, and if you're going to be sharing resources in an equitable way, right, there also has to be an acknowledgement of what is shared and what is distinct among the people in their shared space. So this third phase of it, what we're working on with Friends of the Earth Middle East, and there are some projects like this in the Chicago area that I've become aware of, is the idea of eco-parks or eco-cultural centers. So what does it mean? It means that people come together on the one hand to learn training in sustainability, resource distribution, right, conservation. So people are brought together, especially young people training for careers, right? Our world's changing. And so the way in which we train young people has to shift a little bit. So what we're doing in the Middle East is that there are these eco-parks. And the eco-parks are fantastic. One of them right near the Jordan River in the Palestinian West Bank is entirely built out of recycled materials. The eco-park in Jordan brought together rural Bedouins, cosmopolitan people from Amman, volunteers from all over the world, and they went on a massive campaign of planting thousands of trees. It's an absolutely remarkable place, and creating a shared public space where everyone in that public feels comfortable, right? Your rural people show up, your local farmers, people from Amman come on vacation, people from all over the world. And so the centers really reflect this, and it becomes a place to gather, especially for Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian, and international young people. And they come together on the one hand to learn about sustainability, to learn about resources and resource distribution, but they also come together to build culture together, which on the one hand means that they bring their stories, their music, their artistic traditions, right, their culinary traditions. They bring those together. And everyone experiences those things as something distinct from their background and their cultural experience. But on top of that, the young people and the older ones, when they go, also build collective culture. They're there creating theatrical pieces, writing music, right, creating art. And what's happened on a few occasions is those young people have brought those artworks to policy stakeholders in the region and in the US. Right? They've said, we've got a shared culture that we are building together. But the first piece is very important, because you cannot build that shared culture without a prior acknowledgement of the distinct experiences that everybody brings. Right? Again, a kind of a nod to what I anticipate Adam will say, right? It's not an effacement of history, right? The history is a very important piece. And I think that it really requires an acknowledgement of distinct histories, right? And history is not always a pleasant place, right? History is also the site of suffering, of discrimination, of hardship, and you don't throw that away because you don't throw the memories of your grandparents away, right? Those stay with you. That is something very central to identity, so that has to be acknowledged. And that when that's acknowledged, right, when you create a space where people can hear each other, share that everyday life, there's then an opportunity to start building some collective culture from that. And now that I think of it, I should have brought it, but there's a really, I can send it to Gia, and she can send it to all of you, but there's really a remarkable video of a song that young people from different backgrounds composed together, sang together, played all the instruments, and then filmed in one of these eco-parks. And it is an expression of their hopes for what their future is going to look like, right? And that comes out, and it's great because it really is this integration of distinct musical styles and cultural background, but they bring something together. So that's the kind of work, the cultural piece, that is taking place at these eco parks, for example. And I said a kind of a Chicago example, kind of right near on Ashland Avenue, right near that big Chicago Tribune plant. Has anyone ever gone to that river site? I actually brought, first I'll tell you, I brought some of the people from Friends of the Earth Middle East. I said, look what's being done in Chicago. And I went there, it's a very industrial area, and the Middle Easterner said, this is kind of ugly. And I got really defensive. I was like, well, I mean, it's industry. It's part of the past of Chicago. You know, it needs to be integrated. So it's a small thing, but there has been an educational initiative in Pilsen schools to start bringing students to that stretch of the Chicago River, and they've created a kind of a space. It's kind of a river walk with some mural paintings, but you know, it's kind of a movement towards that. You know, because again, we just as the Middle East is facing polluted rivers, they're facing polluted rivers without, you know, they are not surrounded by freshwater lakes as we are. So it's a little more dire. But at the same time, we've got a polluted river that the city is moving to try to rehabilitate. And I think it's a great moment, for example, to think about how that rehabilitation of the river can actually serve communities across Chicago. And furthermore, how can we get people from various communities and young people involved in that project? How can they bring their culture to bear on it, learn things like how do you rehabilitate a river, and how can they feel that that is a shared resource and a shared space in the city? So, you know, again, our urban landscape is often so defined, as I said before, by the arbitrary lines. But where can we find those places, those projects, and those opportunities where people, different ages, different backgrounds, different phases of legality, different economic backgrounds, where can we highlight the fact of this shared space that we're all in together? And it's a very, very different experience, right, than looking at a map, right? You look at a map, and a map is about reflecting those lines. But you start thinking about shared space. You start thinking about how a river flows through all these communities, right? It really can be central and serve and be a kind of a banner project for these different places. So on the one hand, I think what FOAMI's doing, what we're trying to do in the Middle East, I've been working in the region for a long time, and it's kind of the first, it really is a very, very hopeful model, and one that I think we can bring to bear in a very contested region because, look, everybody, like I said, needs water and energy. There's absolutely no way around it. It seems to be, you know, this is the human experience. And how can we even here bring some of those models from places in much harder situations, right? And how could we use something like a river, you know, like a source of energy, like a water source? How can we use that to really highlight our interdependence and the fact that we all are existing in a very tight, shared space? Thank you very much.